Now, more of Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute, the only show directly addressing the problems and solutions for Illinois. Now, from AM 560, here's Dan Proft.
Dan and Brian back on this edition of Rising, continuing our conversation, post-mortem on Tuesday's midterm elections with state focus. And to help us do that is State Representative and 2018 GOP gubernatorial candidate, Jeanne Ives. Jeanne, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
So many of us, you and me included, said that if we renominate Ronner after the summer he had in 2017 where he betrayed conservatives and center-right voters across a range of issues from immigration policy to junk science on gender to presiding over a third of the Republican caucus voting for a 32% income tax increase to, of course, becoming the most pro-abortion governor in the history of the country by signing HB 40, that he would lose badly, and he would take a lot of Republicans with him. And that's exactly what happened, including his state party chairman mouthpiece, Tim Schneider, who lost his Cook County commissioner seat. It was Tuesday's loss, decimation, really. Do you think that is all on the doorstep of Ronner, or are there other reasons for what happened on Tuesday in Illinois?
You know, if you're calling Ronner the head of the Republican Party, which he supposedly was, then it's all on his doorstep. But he had plenty of people that helped him along that bloodbath. That'd be Tim Schneider. And I include Mark Shaw in that. Mark Shaw lost control of his own Lake County board. It flipped to Democrat, and he's the Lake County Republican chairman, so he owns that loss. Mm-hmm. But when those two started to come in together in April, you saw no unifying message from the Republican Party. They did not holistically take on the Democrats and how they have destroyed the state financially. They never connected with voters on that. They never talked about the policies. They never talked about the issues. They had no vote-by-mail program, which in DuPage County, they had no early vote program either, by the way. In DuPage County, we lost our county clerk, one of the most well-qualified individuals for a position of clerk statewide. We lost him, and he never recovered from the early vote totals. He was down 16,000 when the early vote showed up. He stayed down over 14,900 as the night went on because we had no program from the GOP to get out the vote.
Well, here's the thing about DuPage County, because I hail from there as well, of course, and DuPage County went for Obama twice, went for Hillary Clinton. Now DuPage County has lost a number of seats on the county board, lost the clerk, as you say. Dan Cronin, former state senator and a couple-term DuPage County chairman, barely hung on to the DuPage County board chairmanship. So what's going on? And, of course, you've lost, no Republican challengers won, and you had Peter Breen lose. The Republicans who did win in places like Elmhurst, replacing you in Wheaton and Naperville, Amy Grant, won in a close race. Mike Connolly looks like he's going to lose. David Olson in Downers Grove lost. Is DuPage County lost?
Well, it is for right now. But I think the problem here is that we have not talked about how policies really affect you on a personal level. We have not connected with these women, these suburban women, and let them understand that they're lying to you about pre-existing conditions. They were lying to you about the Trump tax cuts and their real effect. And by the way, you're bailing out Chicago every time you send an income check down to the state. And we have not done a good job messaging. We've been horrible messengers about core issues like that. We haven't let them understand that, you know, your child in those public schools, one, they're not getting well educated. It's at least not as well educated as you think that they are. And, oh, by the way, people actually have Second Amendment rights, and we've done everything possible in this state to protect folks. We have one of the most extensive background checks when you go to buy a gun already. We haven't messaged well. And so I think if we can message better, we can regain this. I think the Democrats are going to be a fiscal disaster, and as long as we can pin it on them, we have an opportunity to win in the future. But if we keep the same party in control, we're never going to realign our messaging to attract those voters.
Hi, Jeannie. It's Brian Timpone. You talked a little yesterday about Chicago and how, the contrast with the suburbs, and how when Democrats are in with Mike Madigan from the suburbs, they're really representing Chicago's interests. Back in the 90s, when Republicans had full control of the state, they did it because they had a suburban united front, in the regional politics of the state. They understood suburban issues, and they also understood that it's kind of a zero-sum game with Chicago. Can you talk a little about the Chicago versus suburban tension in Springfield, and how it's changed over your career?
Well, look, the Chicago influence, think about it now. You've got every single statewide office holder and the governor, and then you have the two legislative leaders, Coalition and Madigan, all living within a couple miles of themselves, all centered in Chicago. So what do you think they're going to do? They're protecting their interests in Chicago, and they need these suburban Democrats to come along with them. And so they pony out a little bit of maybe legislative accomplishments for these guys. Maybe they get a little bit of a consolidation bill that they can, say that they're such a great legislator, but it's all false, because they also get them to buy into these tax increases, and then they get them to do special deals where we're paying for Chicago public school pensions, and they aren't even involved in like the new Tier 3 system. So it's like all these special deals that we're going to continue to pay for. Plus, they're hiding their property wealth. They're massive amounts of property wealth, so it makes them look like they're one of the poorest schools, so they get more state funding. And seriously, they're one of the richest school districts in terms of property. It's just that they're hiding it. And people don't understand how time and time again, the suburbs are really the ATM for the rest of the state. So, but they play their games, and and Republicans, look at Cronin. Cronin I didn't even see him have a primary presence at all. He had no primary election presence. So when it came down to he just thought he'd win handily. And so he didn't help any of his county board members get reelected. He literally wasn't out there messaging. So you've got a failed Republican Party in DuPage County. You've got a failed Republican Party statewide, and nobody talking about the core issues.
So some of it is just work ethic. There's no question. We heard this with Randy Hultgren's campaign. We've heard this with others. It's really the guy who works the hardest is the guy who's been the longest serving House Speaker in the history of our country. So sometimes work, even if the product is objectionable, really matters. And you got a lot of long-time Republican office holders who, are just trying to play out the string, right, and cash in on their pension just like the other side, and don't make much of an effort to help anybody but themselves, and don't offer much distinction between themselves and the other side. And so that's sort of confusing in the burbs, it seems to me.
I couldn't agree more. The Democrats were mobilized. They had, people, Sean Casten's organization were knocking on doors, sometimes 3 times on the same door. Obviously, they had paid volunteers, so they were well funded. They had a lot of money coming in. We didn't have the donor base that the Democrats had, because we haven't articulated what we're going to do with that money and how effective we can be. We haven't cultivated that. So, quite frankly, I don't want to live in a socialist state, but I feel like that's where we're headed. And and we have to explain that to people. The Democrats don't seem to have to explain; they can just go on emotion. But I still believe enough in people that if I explain exactly how they're getting scammed and what their rights are and what type of society we should become, I still believe that I can win them over, at least initially.
That's
where I'm headed.
You're a close ally of Peter Roskam's. How do you process that defeat? And is Peter going to go again in 2020?
I've not talked to Peter yet. I plan on giving him a call soon. I think that, I think a couple things. First of all, Peter's right on the policy. He's a very smart and articulate guy, and he did work his district hard. I think that there was this perception, though, that he didn't really want to meet with people. So by not holding a public town hall, I think that that kind of hurt him. I also think that you had to do more about explaining that pre-existing conditions were something that we had protected, at least in the state of Illinois. And while he was a state rep and state senator, by the way, we had protected for 23 years before even the Affordable Care Act came into being. So you have to take on those arguments, and you have to lean into them. And I think that his team could have messaged better about that and just been more pointed. But again, you're dealing with a media that doesn't want to get your talking points out, and so it's really hard to overcome that if you don't have enough money.
The Tribune opined this week that in terms of rebuilding the shell-shocked Illinois GOP, quote, coalesce around new, fresh leadership in the House and the Senate. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Look, I've served down there for 6 years, and leadership is everything in terms of policy formation. And if we're not, and we're known, we should be known more for our policy and not our emotion. And then you can communicate good policy, and you can actually take on their bad policy. So it goes two ways. But we don't have a brand when 15 Republicans surrender to Democrats on a tax hike. We don't have a brand when we buy into a bunch of bailouts for multi-billion-dollar companies like we did with Exxon. We just don't have a brand when we give corporate carve-outs. Instead, we should make Democrats take the blame for all these tax credits to large corporations that they want to rail against, but actually they're the ones who vote for. They have a terrible voting record when it comes to business. We have a much better one as a caucus. So if you don't have leadership actually formatting those arguments and taking them on in the media as the leader, oh, by the way, because they get to comment on a lot of stuff, they have more of a bully pulpit, then you don't have, then when you just don't even make arguments against the Democrats, then you're not going to win, and that all comes from leadership.
She is State Representative Jeanne Ives, Republican from Wheaton. Jeanne, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.